I clenched the name tag in my fingers, heat rising in my chest. This was not going to go the way she thought it would. For a moment, I just stood there, gripping the name tag, my brain taking an extra second to process what I was looking at. It had my name, but underneath, in smaller letters, someone had written, "The Disappointment." At first, I thought maybe it was some kind of joke. Some awful, tasteless joke. Maybe a cousin trying to be funny. Maybe an unfortunate mix-up. But then I heard her laugh. Stephanie? I looked up and found her across the room, standing near the bar, sipping her wine like she didn't have a care in the world. Our eyes met, and that slow, satisfied smirk spread across her face. I could feel my pulse in my ears. A few people had noticed me standing there now, stealing glances in my direction. No one said anything, but I could feel the weight of it, the expectation. I could almost hear the words they weren't saying. "Don't make a scene." I took a slow breath and placed the name tag back down on the table. I smoothed it out, aligning it perfectly with the others. For a second, I almost laughed. Of course. Of course she did something like this. This was classic Stephanie. Not an outright insult. Nothing blatant enough for people to immediately call her out on. Just subtle enough that if I reacted, I would look like the problem. I should have known the second I walked through the door that something like this was coming. A hand touched my shoulder. I turned to see my aunt, the only person in this family who had ever really understood me. Her brows were drawn together, lips pressed into a tight line. She'd seen the name tag. Her eyes flickered toward Stephanie. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. I forced a tight smile. "Yeah." I said, "I'm fine." But I wasn't. I was exhausted. Exhausted in a way I didn't even know how to describe, because this wasn't new. This wasn't even the worst thing she'd done. This was just the latest in a long, long pattern of making sure I always knew my place. I should have walked out right then. I should have turned around and left. But something in me said, no. Not this time. So instead, I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and did something I knew would catch them off guard. I smiled. A real, easy smile, like nothing had happened at all. Then I picked up a glass of champagne from a passing server, clinked it lightly with my nail, and turned toward the room. Because if Stephanie wanted a show, I was going to give her one. I raised my glass just slightly, feeling the weight of the room shift as a few people glanced in my direction. I hadn't made a scene. Not yet. But the quiet clink of my nail against the glass had drawn just enough attention. Just enough to make Stephanie hesitate for a fraction of a second before taking another slow sip of her wine. Her eyes narrowed slightly, like she was trying to figure out what I was doing. I let the moment stretch just a little longer than necessary, like I was considering making a toast, before I gave a small shake of my head and turned away, heading deeper into the party. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of reacting. Not yet. The party itself was exactly what I expected. Crowded, overly polished, with expensive catering and carefully curated decorations. Stephanie had gone all out, as she always did, because everything in her life had to be a performance. This wasn't just about celebrating my dad's birthday. It was about showing off, about making sure people knew how perfect her life was, how loved she and my father were, how successful their children had become. Their children, not me. Hunter and Olivia were already holding court in the middle of the room, surrounded by a small group of relatives, all nodding along as Olivia gushed about her upcoming wedding. "And of course, Dad's paying for everything," she was saying, flashing a bright, practiced smile as she twirled the massive diamond on her finger. "We wanted something tasteful, you know? A real elegant wedding, not one of those tacky Pinterest disasters." I bit back a laugh. Olivia had always been like this, polished, rehearsed, just the right amount of self-absorbed to make sure everything revolved around her without seeming too obvious about it. Hunter, meanwhile, was leaning against the bar, nodding along as a few of my dad's old friends congratulated him on his new job, one I was certain he hadn't actually earned. Hunter had never worked for anything in his life. Every opportunity had been handed to him, every mistake quietly cleaned up by my father. I was halfway tempted to walk over and insert myself into the conversation just to watch them squirm. But before I could, I heard my father's voice. I turned, and he was already making his way toward me, a drink in hand, his expression carefully neutral. "I didn't think you were going to come." I smiled, but it wasn't a real smile. Wouldn't miss it. He nodded, glancing at the room around us before looking back at me. You've been keeping busy, I hear. There it was, the polite, careful way he avoided actually asking anything about my life. The same way he always did. I nodded. Yeah, work's been good. I bought a house last year. His brow lifted slightly. A house. Yep. He took a sip of his drink, not asking anything else. That was the thing about my dad. He hated when I did anything that made it impossible for him to see me as the failure he always thought I'd be.